The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. The birth of Jesus, the Messiah, took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to dismiss her quietly. But when he had resolved to do this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. "Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel," which means God is with us. When Joseph awoke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took Mary as his wife. A gospel inspired by God. Head. Okay. So speaking of divine, I'm sure, like me, all of you grew up in a Catholic tradition where you got the impression that only one child was ever conceived directly by God without the use of a human father, and that was Jesus of Nazareth, yeah? Until you begin to study world literature, and you find out that this is a motif that occurs again and again and again. Not just in spiritual literature, but in just folklore and mythology as well. And so, for instance, there's a story about the Buddha, that the mother of the Buddha, before she conceived him, had a vision where a white elephant came and pierced her side with his tusk. And 10 months later, she gave birth to the Buddha. So he was conceived by an elephant god. Yeah? There's a story of the great prophet Zarathustra in Persia, that the mother of this prophet was swimming in a lake and was impregnated by seed that had been dropped in the lake 600 years previously by another prophet. And Alexander the Great, there's a story about Alexander the Great, that his father was actually the god Marduk, and that he imitated the form of Alexander's father Philip, and cuckolded him, had sex with Philip's wife, and she gave birth to Alexander the Great. And so that Alexander the Great also, his father was a divine being. So this story that divine beings impregnate human women, you find it all over mythology. Greeks, Romans, and we have a few versions of it in Celtic mythology, Irish folklore. There's a story I've told you a few years ago, I think, of Etain, a fairy princess in the Irish tradition, the most beautiful fairy princess that lived, underground in Ireland. And a king took her as his second wife. And the first wife got really jealous, so she employed a druid to put a spell on Etain and turned Etain into a butterfly, and then created this tornado to drive her out of the fairy kingdom, and she came up into the land of human beings as a butterfly. And she was protected for a few hundred years by Angus, the god of love among the fairy folk. But eventually at one stage she flies in front of the tornado into a palace, and she's perched on a rafter like this in the banquet hall, and right underneath her is the queen having a glass of wine in the big banquet hall, and the little fairy princess, now in the form of a butterfly, falls asleep and falls right down into the goblet of wine, and the queen doesn't notice and drinks it, and 9 months later gives birth to a baby girl. So there's lots of ways of conceiving. So this story of Jesus this morning is not unique to the Christian tradition, even if we were brought up to think it was. That somehow there are circumstances in which women can conceive without the use of a human agent. And so here's the story they're trying to propagate about Jesus. Now, it didn't quite stick, because even in his adult life, there's an accusation that Jesus is illegitimate. So in one of the Gospels, when Jesus is going back to Nazareth after he's begun his public ministry, and they're asking, who the hell is this guy to be preaching to us? Isn't this Jesus, the son of Joseph? But in another version, in one of the Gospels, it says, isn't this Jesus, the son of Mary? So he's not identified as the son of Joseph, he's identified as the son of Mary. Now, a man was only identified as the son of his mother if there was no father. And I don't mean that the father had died, I mean there was no father. And so this was actually an accusation that Jesus was a bastard. Isn't this, who the hell is this guy to be preaching to us? We know about him. Didn't his mother conceive illegitimately before herself and the daddy got together? And so, this guy is illegitimate. Who is he to be talking to us? So now here's Matthew writing his gospel, and he's trying to work with this material, that Jesus as an adult, as the Messiah, or as this great preacher, is being accused of being illegitimate. So Matthew has two approaches to it. The first one we've just heard, where he claims that Jesus' mother was impregnated by the Holy Spirit, and even Joseph was told that this was the case. That's the first line of attack. The second line of attack is very interesting. There's a genealogy of Jesus in Matthew's gospel. There's one in Luke's gospel as well, but the one in Luke is much more truncated. But in Matthew's version, there are 42 ancestors of Jesus named in his genealogy, going right back to Adam. There's 14 generations from Adam to King David, and there's 14 from David to the Babylonian exile, and there's 14 generations from the Babylonian exile to the birth of Jesus. So there's 42 generations of Jesus. And every single one of them, except 4, are males. There are only 4 women mentioned in Jesus' genealogy. And every single one of the 4 has some kind of a sexual peccadillo attached to her. The first one is Tamar. And Tamar flourishes about the year 1750 BC. And she's the daughter-in-law of Judah. And Judah has given one of his sons to this woman in marriage, and the son died. And so the custom was she had to marry a brother. So she marries his brother, and the brother dies. Now, Judah has only one other son left, and he doesn't want to give it to this woman. So he's afraid that he'll die as well. So he tells her, go back to your father's house, and when my final son is of an age to marry, I'll let you know. So she waits for years and years and years, and the guy is a big strapping lad, and she still doesn't get to marry him. So she's really upset about it. So she dresses up as a prostitute, and she's sitting at the fork in the road, and Judah is passing by, and he says, how much? And she makes a bargain with him, and they have intercourse, and she conceives, and she gives birth to twins. And Judah finds out that his daughter-in-law is pregnant, and he's outraged. So they take her out to stone her. And then she says, well, the person by whom I'm pregnant owns these 2 things. She had taken his staff and something else, as a token, because he had no money with him at the time, and they belonged to him. And then he discovers they're his own kids. So that's the first woman that's in his genealogy. The second one is a woman called Rahab. And Rahab flourishes about the year 1210 BC. So when they try to go into the promised land after they've escaped out of Egypt, they send in spies to reconnoiter the land. And the spies come back out and say, there's no way we can take this. The people in this country are giants. But in their reconnoitering, they came across this prostitute called Rahab. And she was a prophetess. She said, when you come in to conquer this land, I want you to spare my household. And so I'm going to put a red ribbon out my window so you know which house is mine. I don't know if this is the origin of the red light district or not. I have no idea. But they come in to conquer the land, and they destroy Jericho. There's only one house left standing, and it's the house with the red ribbon hanging out the window. And it's Rahab's house. And then one of them takes Rahab as his wife. So that's the second woman mentioned in Jesus' genealogy. The third one is Bathsheba. And Bathsheba wasn't even Jewish. She wasn't a Hebrew. But she seduces David's great-grandfather. When he's drunk, while he's harvesting the fields, she seduces him. And the phrase that's used is, she lifts the corner of his robe. Be very careful about lifting the corner of somebody's robe. So he impregnates her. And she's the great-grandmother of King David. And the fourth woman that's mentioned is Bathsheba. And Bathsheba was the wife of Solomon, whom Solomon stole from another man and impregnated, and she gave birth. David stole from another man, impregnated, and she gave birth to Solomon. So they're the only 4 women mentioned in Jesus' genealogy. So why is Matthew doing this? He's saying more or less, look, he says, if our ancestor King David, the greatest king who ever lived, had this kind of an ancestry, why are you concerned about Jesus, whether he is illegitimate or not? So it's not a big deal. Look at these 4 women in our ancestry. They had issues, sexual issues as well, but they turned out to be kind of the forebears of King David, and therefore the forebears of Jesus. So this was Matthew's double-pronged attack to deal with the accusation that Jesus was illegitimate. All right, guys. Karenina.
These women were Jewish.
Well, it's interesting. It depends how you define Jewish. Then, is Jewish descendant from Abraham via Sarah? That they'd have to come down through the lineage of Isaac. So in that instance, 3 of the 4 would have been Jewish. But the exception would have been, no, Rahab would not have been Jewish, even though she's the ancestor of King David. And Bathsheba may not have been, because she was the wife of a foreign man, so she may not have been Jewish. So maybe 2 out of 4, strictly speaking, were in the heritage. So I know what the point you're making then, of course, is that in the Jewish tradition, you're only Jewish if your mother was Jewish. The descent goes through the female lineage. It doesn't go through the male lineage. So you're not Jewish if you're born to a Jewish father, but your mother is not Jewish, you're not Jewish unless you convert to Judaism. So in that instance, it's doubtful even if David himself or Jesus himself, strictly speaking, was in the Jewish lineage. Yeah.
It sounds like they don't trust the women.
It sounds like which?
It sounded like they don't trust the women.
They trust him too
well,
much.
because they've been sleeping around with a lot of men, and so that's why they say it has to be.
The lineage comes through the woman. Yeah.
So they don't trust the men.
Well, you don't trust. Well, you look at it this way. Up to very, very recently, any woman could be 100% sure that the child she was giving birth to was her own. No man could be sure that the child his wife was giving birth to was his. But you can be sure if you're a woman, it was. Until we had surrogate motherhood, and now you get implanted. And now you can give birth to a child that wasn't your own. It's not your own egg, or your husband's sperm. And so up to very recently, the woman could be always sure that the child she's giving birth to is her child. But the man could never be certain that the child his wife is giving birth to is his. And that led to all this circumscribing of women, and you can keep them enclosed and making sure they didn't kind of wander from the flock. Yeah.
Word temptation.
Margaret, what are you thinking?
It's all straightforward.
It's not straightforward. Not a problem.
No, no problem.
Very good.